Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the office. This is Com 350, and we are moving from the classical Greeks into the classical Romans. What an exciting leap to take, I guess. um, it is time for us to talk a little bit about what you've been reading this week, week 4, which should be the Romans. So let's talk generally about the Romans. As you know, I told you just to skim the Sublime from Longinus or Longinus. I'm not really sure which way it is. They don't sound like a nice name to me either way. If you've gotten to on the Sublime and you have sort of looked through it, that's all you need to do. You don't really need very much from that. In fact, you know what? I'm going to change that and just say don't bother. You don't need to read on the Sublime. We've got a lot more stuff to read, and we have a short period of time to do it. And there's more important things in the other 3 that I'm going to talk about today. So go ahead and just skip Longinus. And if you have read on the Sublime, well, then you're better educated, which is a good thing. And you can write about it if you want to eventually. So I will be talking today about Hermagoras, or Anonymous, as your book has it listed, Cicero and Quintilian. And you guys need dates for your papers or some sort of guidance on that, I think. And a couple of you have asked me about that. And I don't like to do due dates. So I'm making sure I don't regret this decision. But for the past several years, I have not had due dates for the paper. And let me tell you how that works. I say, hey, during the course of the semester before the last day of classes, so the day before dead day or study day or whatever you guys refer to it as, the day before that, the last day of classes, you can turn in your papers all the way up to and including that. If I do that, essentially what I'm doing to myself is saying, hey, at the end of the semester, you're going to be up all night grading one night because you'll get all the papers towards the end of the semester. And actually, that hasn't happened. I haven't had to stay up all night one night or anything like that, even though most of the papers do trickle in towards the end of the semester because we all procrastinate. Yeah, that's, to be honest with you, it hasn't really been that bad. So I'm going to go ahead again this year and say there are no due dates for the papers as long as you get both of them into me before the last day of classes for the semester, which will be a Thursday in December. And I don't remember the exact date, but it's the Thursday before study day Friday. All right. Hopefully that helps. I will say that if you are going to write them, do them in order. So paper 1, then paper 2, that'll be very helpful to you. And paper 2, you really can't start until probably, early November. So you still have like a month and a half from there to write it. But early November may be the earliest that you can really start putting that paper in and submitting it. So if I do that, you can ask me anything you want about the papers in between now and when you turn them in. But please don't ask me to read them and grade them and then you don't like your grade and you rewrite it. That's not how I work. So once we get a final submission, feel free to ask me anything that you want during the course of your writing, but please don't ask me to grade it and then regrade it. That's a lot of work. So if you're a person who really needs deadlines, and I do know that there are people like that. I myself am sort of that way. I work better if I have a deadline. Let's put it this way. I would have my first paper in like in the middle of October to late October. Let's say I'm just going to randomly choose a date here and say Friday, October 21st by midnight. So if you're someone who absolutely needs a due date, then by midnight on October 21st should be your first paper. And then your second paper, the last day of classes, the day before dead day, by midnight. Okay, which I can probably find out what that is. I believe it is December 15th, I believe. I think I'm right. Nope, I'm not right, because that would be the end of finals week. I believe it's December 8th. December 8th. So December 8th by midnight should be your second paper. So if you obviously haven't turned in your first paper by then, you need to turn in both your first paper and your second paper by then, and so that I can grade them and you can have a grade for the class, okay? A good grade for the class, because all of you are going to get A's, right? We're all working for the A. So hopefully that helps you a bit. If you want to turn in your paper on a deadline, as I said, October, I forgot what I said just a minute ago, October, what did I say? 14th, October 14th by midnight. There's your deadline, and your second paper on December, the day before Dead Day, which I believe is the 8th. And hopefully that helps you. Okay. So for those of you who do not need deadlines and sort of don't procrastinate anyway, there you've got your freedom to turn them in whenever you'd like. The first paper obviously is very easy in the sense of topic choice. That shouldn't be real difficult. I would encourage you not to pick like a huge topic, pick something smaller so you can cover it in a shorter amount of space on the page. But other than that, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about that, please let me know. You all have learned that emailing me is fine, but texting me is probably better. That's probably more helpful. All right, let's move on to what we're talking about today, which is the classical Roman period. Now, as we move from the classical Greek period, where we were really talking about rhetoric versus sort of philosophy, or rhetoric versus, philosophy. I'm going to go with that. Plato, sort of the philosopher king, and Aristotle, sort of the practical, like, we need to do something with this. I think that your book refers to it as the systematic Aristotle, who gives you a playbook for how to persuade and how to use rhetoric, when to use it. And you all have some lovely concepts, ideas from Aristotle that make great test questions, like list the 3 artificial proofs, right? That's an easy question. Things like that will go on your exam eventually when we get there. All right, so let's talk about moving into Rome. If the classical Greeks were about the debate between philosophy and rhetoric, then what is the classic Roman period about? And that is very simply rhetoric versus power. Okay, there's this relationship between rhetoric and power that's very important to understand as we move into the classical Roman period. Now, I say classical Roman period where there are 2 different structures that we're going to be studying, 2 different governments, really, types of government. So let's start with that first rule about the relationship between rhetoric and power. Rhetoric, let's put it this way. The more decentralized a power, so the more spread out the power amongst the people, the greater the need for rhetoric. Okay? The more centralized a power, the more it's just at 2 or 3 or 1 person in charge, the less need you have for rhetoric. Let that sink in, and I know what your question is. How does that possibly make sense when Hitler needed to use rhetoric so well? Well, actually, that's a pretty easy question to answer. And I'm not going to lie to you, when I first heard that sort of, I don't know what to call it. It's sort of a pithy way of summarizing power and rhetoric. A sort of pop culture way of doing it. I was originally like, that's crazy talk, because obviously in an authoritarian regime, there is a lot of rhetoric coming from the top down, right? Very true. But if that's the case, what do you need to understand? You're told what to do. You don't argue with that. You don't debate it. You don't need to know how to speak persuasively, because you're being told what to do. So the more centralized a power, the less need you have to participate, because you don't have any power. So in authoritarian leadership or top-down approaches to any type of leadership, there is no need for practicing rhetoric if there's a person or a couple people at the top and the rest of us are just, living our life according to the rules. All right. So Hitler actually needed to understand the art of rhetoric a great deal so that he could rise to power. Okay. He had to convince large numbers of people to follow him. He had to convince large numbers of higher ups in leadership and powerful people to help buoy him up to power. He needed all of that when he was not in power. Once he got into power, he could just stand up and speak and say anything, and everything in German sounds angry anyway. He could say whatever he wants. I mean, I love my Slavic roots, but my goodness, why do we always sound so angry when we're talking? But the idea is that once he was in power, all he had to do was say things that were the rules and regulations of living under his authority. All right. So even in the most popular reference for authoritarian leadership, Adolf Hitler, we see that the need for rhetoric amongst the people was nothing. In fact, the more rhetoric that people were exposed to, the greater challenge there is to an authoritarian regime. This is why democracy, a democratic republic, works the way that it does, is because we have the right to understand what our leaders are saying to us and to have input in that leadership. So what's the first thing that any authoritarian leader does, or someone who's striving for authoritarian leadership? What's the first thing that they do? Well, in our modern age, they cut off all media. They cut off the outside world to you. They don't want you to know what's going on out there. This is very, very evident in North Korea, for example, right now. Right before the Arab Spring, I think we still refer to it as the Arab Spring, when people wanted to fight back against authoritarianism or authoritarianism and be more democratic. What's the first thing you get rid of? Information. People being able to practice rhetoric, to be able to gather together information, get together themselves, and to make arguments for themselves and advocate for themselves. That is a big no-no in authoritarian centralized regimes, okay? So very obvious. The first thing you do is cut off all information, knowledge getting, education, and in our day and age, the internet, and any chats or video calls or anything like that to the outside world, because you don't want anybody to become educated in what could be. Okay. That is really difficult for me to say right now, because I just heard people in leadership in our country say that the media is the enemy of the state, which anyone who studies history knows that anytime you refer to something as the state, that is probably not a good sign, especially when you're trying to prop up the state and you don't like enemies of the state. To say that the media is the enemy of all people, the enemy of the government, is a very dangerous path to go down if you want to preserve a decentralized government. Now, I'm not saying that it was one person who said that. I've actually heard it from more than one person in high leadership positions. So that is a very scary proposition, and that is because of the relationship between rhetoric and power, that the more decentralized a government you have, where people have power, the greater the need for rhetoric, for understanding it and knowing how to use it to your advantage. And then, of course, if you just have one person or very few people in charge, you don't need to understand what's going on. You don't need to understand what the government's telling you, because you just have rules and regulations. You follow them, and that's that. All right. So not to get dark there for a second, that really went to a dark place. I didn't mean for it to. It never has gone that far before. I'm always able to use sort of an east-west division. The Western world tends to lean towards different democracies, different forms of democracies, be they parliamentary, republic, whatever. We tend to lean that direction more than we lead towards authoritarianism. Despite what is going on in Great Britain right now and the way that it's always been, yes, they have a monarchy, but the monarchy is not 100% in charge, obviously. The people support the monarchy vis-a-vis parliament, honestly. So there are all different types of decentralized systems that we can find. This classroom is much more authoritarian than it is, democratic. And the reason for that is because we're not even in the same space. So, and we're asynchronous. So all I can do is send stuff out and you can send stuff back, but that's all we've got. I really prefer to be in the classroom where you all can sort of dictate how the conversation goes and what I talk about and so on. And that's very difficult to do in an asynchronous online class, as you probably have already figured out. So that idea that we are in fact spread across time and space right now, literally decentralized, and yet, really in a way very centralized, because I'm sort of telling you what to do and you do it, and that's that. And I'm not comfortable with it, but it is what it is right now, and it is where we have to be. So I'm going to stop complaining about it, but demonstrate to you that rhetoric actually has real roots, even in our classroom at the moment. All right. So Hermagoras is sort of our transitional person between the classical Greeks and the classical Romans. How is that so? Why is it anonymous, et cetera, et cetera? Well, the reason it's listed as anonymous is because we're not really 100% sure who actually wrote this piece. Some people claim that it was Cicero. Others claim it was Hermagoras, and I believe there's some other theorists named for who might have written this piece. But it is the stasis system. And what is the stasis system? Well, the stasis system, as you know, stasis is that place where rhetoric begins. The stasis system is for one type of rhetoric only, and that is courtroom rhetoric. The stasis system essentially sets up a chronology for how you ask questions in a courtroom and what questions you should be asking. And essentially it starts with sort of this idea of what are the things that happened? What's happened that's brought us here? And you've got, two people, or you've got the government against the people, or something along those lines. You've got opposition coming together where there is some sort of clash or dispute, okay? And that's based on what has happened. What are the basic knowable facts of the case? Who did what to whom, when, and how can we, and how do we prove that? The second sort of part of stasis questioning is to ask about whether or not the law was violated. All right. So sort of if you watch Law and Order, I just gave this lecture in argumentation. So if you watch Law and Order or anything like that, a television show, or if you're going to study law, or if you've been in a courtroom, and I'm sorry to those of you in both of these classes, you're hearing the same thing twice for a second, then you see this happen. They start off with, did you do this so-and-so? Did you see this so-and-so, etc., for understanding what happened that we're questioning. And then we start to sort of look at what laws we're using and defining what actions were taken. And then we talk about why those actions were taken, if they were proved to be taken. And then we leave it up to the jury to make a decision from that point. In other words, we create stasis for them, and then we have them make a decision between guilt and innocence. And during that time, when we're in a trial, you may hear objection. You may hear that there's going to be an appeal filed because somehow the process of the courtroom was incorrect, inaccurate, or problematic in some way. It was unfair. So that is what Hermagoras talks about, is sort of I'm going to say Hermagoras right now. That's Hermagoras. Hermagoras. I'm not looking at the spelling of it. I was really, really trying to remember, and I'm looking down, which is a weird place to look when you're trying to remember. Hermagoras. We're going to say that because anonymous is just too clunky. So what Hermagoras was saying was, if you go into a courtroom, here's the order in which you have to establish your argument in order to be successful. That's the entirety of that piece. The Rhetorica ad Herennium. All right. Okay. So that sort of occurs somewhere between uh, Greece and the rise of Rome. And we're not really sure where or how, but the good news is it was preserved. So we know that that's a something that exists, and it helps us understand, because during the time of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, as I told you in the first lecture, a lot of rhetoric was studied because of accusations and defenses, particularly in courtrooms. Okay. I don't know if I ever really gave you guys this story or not, but I'm going to give it to you because I think it helps us understand what was going on during the time of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, what sophists were actually used for, and what we were talking about with why it was accusation and defense. Why was that happening all the time? So, my history is terrible. I am really, really awful with which wars they were. I want to say it was like Phoenician, or it was, I don't know what war it was that was going on. There were probably several, honestly. There were these wars going on, and what would happen is when you won the war, let's say Team A wins the war, Team A goes and, sets up shop in their new home. Okay, they've taken it over, so they can choose to stay there. And the people who returned from war were not real thrilled about that, as I'm sure you can imagine. If you went and fought in a war and you lost, and then you come home and you don't have a house anymore because it's occupied by other people, the people who just beat you down, that's going to cause some trouble. So these wars of land and claims of land led to a lot of courtroom necessity. Somebody had to decide who gets to live in that house, who gets to have that land. And so this is how that sort of started, was we would send someone in to speak for us or to teach us how to speak, to defend our right to our house or land that we have either had or that we are taking over. All right. So at this time, we have a lot of sophists being trained by other sophists in this particular art, this particular practice. And there was a story of two particular ones named Corax and Tithias. Excuse me. Wow. Why I couldn't get that name out? I don't know. So Corax was actually the teacher, and Tithias was actually the student. And Corax taught Tithias, and Tithias paid Corax. Well, Tithias decided to take Corax to court, and he claimed that he should get all of his money back that he paid Corax because he was not taught rhetoric well enough. He was not taught sophistry well enough. And so they made these arguments. Corax said, listen, I taught him well enough. He should not get his money back. And you should believe that argument. And therefore, I should win. However, if you think that he's argued better than I have, then that proves that I taught him so well that he could beat me in a court of law, and therefore you still side with me. And of course, Tithias came back with, wait a minute, no, you didn't teach me well enough. And to prove that you hadn't, if you all think that I lost, that proves that he did not teach me well enough. And so we're at this literal point of stasis of no answer. There's no answer. Somebody has to make a choice at that point. I imagine that some people say, well, how did it turn out? I don't know. I think we tell this story to our students to prove what the perfect argument or debate looks like. And it would never exist anywhere. But I would imagine it was something along the idea of Solomon of, fine, you pay him this amount and you pay him this amount. It's the same exact amount, right? So it just sort of like settles itself. But I honestly don't know. But that is what was going on at the time, was that judges were made. They were called in. They were appointed to make a decision about who should have whose land. And that's where all of this started. So when Hermagoras comes along and says, here's a specific way to apply rhetoric in the courtroom, he literally means it for that limited space. And if you do go to law school, you will hear this again. That is how we do court right now, whether it's family court or criminal court or other civil court. It doesn't matter. This is how we do it. In fact, the first part of a contract is just definitions of who is who. Okay. So if that gives you any sense or idea of how that works in the courtroom, hopefully it does. So when you read through it, that's what you're reading. Okay. The rise of the Roman Republic was a democratic, at the time, not a direct democracy. It was a Republican democracy, a democratic republic, I should say. So, yes, a republic is still a democracy. I had to have that debate recently. It pains me to have that debate. I think I might have mentioned that to you before. It pains me to have that debate. But yes, a republic is still a democracy. A direct democracy where everyone who has a stakeholder has a say is sort of what we saw in Greece. In Rome, we have more of a representative republic form of democracy. So in order for us to understand what was going on, those of us in the outskirts of the cities who weren't in the cities, who were not participating, we needed to be informed about what was going on in the Senate. And so what would happen is people would go and watch these speakers, and then they would go to various different towns and repeat what that speaker said, not verbatim, but get the message out there, perhaps in a different way, but make sure that you get all the points that the senator said. Those are really who we call the first official rhetoricians, people who went and explained the government to the people. Now, we saw this happen in Phaedrus, in Plato's Phaedrus, when Phaedrus goes and watches Lysias speak and then comes back and repeats that speech for Plato, actually, Socrates in the story. Socrates doesn't even give him a chance to repeat the speech. He repeats it all these different ways, which is nutty, but cool. Definitely demonstrating that a rhetorician could take any message and turn it into what that rhetorician wants to. Aristotle would say that's not rhetoric. Other people would say that's the very definition of rhetoric. If I'm not there to witness my senator speaking, but I only listen to someone who tells me what my senator said, then that is another layer of persuasion. Well, Cicero understood this, okay? And he really wanted to help rhetoricians understand how to go out and do the job correctly. And he relied on Aristotle for this. So Cicero, who lived during the time of the Republic, gives us this piece called De Orte, I believe. Is that the one that he wrote, or was that Quintilian? Wow. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I don't need to check that. Cicero wrote De Orte, or On Speaking. And essentially what he does is he says that, listen, when you get up to speak, you have to be a good person. You have to have, use ethos, pathos, and logos. And he takes everything that Aristotle said and he puts it into order for us. Essentially what Cicero is writing and what you're reading is the first public speaking textbook. All right. It's literally, this is how you do it. Okay. Now I'm singing that song in my head. So specifically, he writes it in terms of the 5 canons of rhetoric. All right. So when people say Aristotle came up with the 5 canons, not really. I mean, yes, he wrote about all these different parts of how to do rhetoric, but it was really Cicero who came along and said, all right, here's the 5 basic rules for rhetoric that you must have in order to be a good rhetorician. All right. So what are those? The 5 canons of rhetoric, the 5 must-haves of rhetoric: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. Now, some people have told me that your book switches style and memory. That's fine. Does not matter. I mean, that's the order they go in, but we can debate about memory and style, I guess, being different. But Cicero really gets specific in telling us exactly how we're supposed to do each of those actions, how we're supposed to come to terms with each of those canons, those rules, when we write a speech. And that's what he talks about. I'll stop there. No, just kidding. So the first thing we know is that Cicero redefines rhetoric in a lot of ways, but he doesn't redefine it any differently than Aristotle does, to be honest with you. Quintilian will do something a little bit different. But Cicero does say that you must be a good person speaking well. So you have to be a good person who speaks well, meaning that you have to be ethical. And he says, here are the 5 rules. So let's look at those 5 rules. What is invention? Invention is the sort of way you come to terms about what it is you need to speak about. Is there an event that's happened, like ceremonial speech, that you need to speak about? Are you in a courtroom talking about what's happened in the past? Are you in a deliberative house or in a deliberative body that needs to determine what should and should not be done next? Then, once you know what sort of category or genre or context you're speaking in, has something happened, or is there something that is necessary to promote? What is that thing? And why does my audience need to hear about it? And what audience do I deliver this to? So all of those questions sort of go in. It's not just like pick a topic. Okay, that is not invention. Invention is literally thinking about all of the means of persuasion, context included, that are going to go into the topic choice. All right. Then you have arrangement. You'll notice this is not organization. Everybody, this is not organization. This is arrangement. There is a specific way that you should present your argument that helps your audience walk through the argument with you until you get to the conclusion. So it's not just like spatial, chronological, those organizational patterns. I mean, those are good to know and good to have, and they're very helpful, but they are not necessarily the arrangement that you want to use. Choosing the right arrangement may be as simple as saying, I'm going to talk about this chronologically, but it's often a little bit more difficult than that, or more detailed than that when we think about our audiences, which we'll get to in a second. Style. This is where we get to audiences. See, I told you it would be a second. So according to Cicero, there are 3 levels of style. There is the common style, there is the grand style, and there is, hold your horses, the middle style. All right. These 3 levels of style, if you will, aren't really levels. They are 3 different styles. They are all still formal. You're still getting a formal speech, no matter which one you're sort of going to use. Cicero says you must consider your audience when you do this. He says you must consider your clothing when you choose what style you use, which toga you should wear. I mean, literally, I'm not kidding. He at one point, I don't think it's in your book, but at one point Cicero talks about if you have to get your audience's attention, they're not paying attention, take off your toga. I mean, just... Sure, Cicero, let's do that. The fun parts of Cicero are the parts that they skip, they're giving you just the basic, which I guess is okay. So Cicero says there's these 3 levels of style, or 3 types of style, or 3 styles. The grand is sort of literally the big gestures. My screen is very small, my camera is. So grand gestures, like you're really like taking up a lot of space. It's big and you're loud. And you're not just using highfalutin language, but you are using complicated language because you're extremely eloquent. Who do I liken this to? 100% my favorite things in the world as an example, well, favorite people to use as an example for this is television evangelists. Televangelists are practicing the grand style all the time. And there's a reason for that. We're going to learn about that later. But they use the big gestures. I mean, my favorite is a guy whose name I can't remember at the moment. It will come to me. He's down in Texas. He has a really big following, mega church down there. He's worth bazillions. He's got these beady little eyes. He's always like this. He's a good looking man though. He has this huge guy smiley smile, which I can't do because I'm missing a tooth at the moment. But he always is holding up his Bible. He's always preaching with big gestures. He moves away from the podium. He walks out towards his audience. Why I can't remember this guy's name is beyond me. But whenever, when I used to watch television, I don't really do that anymore, but when I used to watch television, I used to scan through, and sometimes he was on and I was just mesmerized. I couldn't stop looking at it. I had a boyfriend several years ago who was the same way. He's like, wait, what's he talking about? We did not care what he was saying. It was just, it was sort of let me see if I can do this. We are all going to hell, and that is okay. God can save us from going to hell. Can I get an amen? I mean, I was just like, wait, this guy is amazing as far as that grand style of getting your attention. And it's helpful if you're talking to people who already agree with you. This is not necessarily the most persuasive style, okay? It's for a very specific audience, and it is for eloquence and inspiration, a lot more than it's for persuading. We want to persuade people to do something, but they're already on board with the majority of it. I mean, if you go to this super church, this mega church, and see this guy whose name is still escaping me, you guys are probably screaming at your screens. That guy, if you go to his church or you're watching him on television, chances are good you're already watching him for a reason. You already know why you're there. So persuasion, maybe a little bit here and there, but more inspiration to do certain things. Okay, so that's the grand style, and I can't believe I can't come up with that guy's name. The next style, middle style, let's talk about middle style, which you would think they could come up with a better name than middle. I mean, Cicero wrote in like 100 BCE. It has been, 2,100 and some years? You would think that we could come up with a better name than middle. The middle style is literally the type of style that you would use with a certain particular audience who is a little bit more educated than when you're using the common style, who needs to be persuaded in one way or another, which means they also need to be educated. So you're not just sort of doing the direct, I'm speaking down to you, I'm telling you what to do, I'm not just giving you directions, but I'm having a conversation with you in which I'm inviting you to participate and think about what I'm saying. That middle style is generally used by our presidents, hopefully by some of our other political leaders. I have seen some pretty weird stuff in the past 6 years or so, 6 or 8 years. So how is it that you present when you want to teach somebody something and get them persuaded as well? You talk to them at their level. So you give them some common denominator. You assume a certain level of education. A lot of teachers use this style. The common style is not, I'm jamming it and talking street with my friends. No, this is still a formal speech. The common style, though, is for when you are attempting to give information and you're trying to convince people just to listen to you. So you're going to use a very conversational style, one that is relaxing. It's easy to listen to. You're going to take down the eloquence and the 50-cent words a little bit. You're speaking not to a less educated audience necessarily, but you're speaking in a way that their language, that your language is understandable to them, that it fits within their experience of language. Okay. And that's incredibly important, Cicero says, because if you're going to go out and speak to common folk, you need to be able to speak in a way that they're going to be able to listen and understand. That just makes sense. Now, a lot of people have said, okay, so Obama and Reagan maybe were sort of this grand style. Maybe George H.W. Bush was more of a middle style. And maybe Bill Clinton and George W. were common style. And I'm like, no. First of all of them are presidents or were presidents. And second of all, none of them spoke in sort of a jive street talk way, using, jargon that nobody understood. I haven't determined how I feel about Trump yet on this, but I do know that when you're the president, it's very difficult for you to use the common style because you are speaking from a position of power already. So generally, you're already at the middle style, just based on the office and the ethos that office carries with it. Okay. So style is not just style. Style is very specific, and Cicero has some very clear rules about style. The next I'm going to go with is memory. Now, a lot of people think, oh, you are able to memorize. No, that is not what that means. Let me be clear about this. Now, remember what I said before, that the job of the rhetorician was to listen to a speech and then go out to the outskirts of the city and proclamate that speech to them, giving them the same ideas, telling them the intent of that, and doing it in a way in which they might understand. So you might be using common style when you're out there, and you might sometimes be able to use the middle style. But for the most part, you have to interpret for them, not word for word, not verbatim, not and word for word does mean verbatim. Sorry about that, but not verbatim, but memory in the sense of you are presenting or representing the intent and the true meaning of what the person in government said, your senator or somebody else. So memory is about sort of rehearsing the tradition of speaking and taking that seriously and making sure that you represent, you're literally representing the speech that you heard. Now, today, we do the same thing. We just don't usually go listen to a speech and then come back and repeat that speech or some version of it. That's not what we do. No, instead, what we do is we listen to a speech and we might be telling somebody else about it, or we might listen to the news media and hear them interpret it for us in one style or another. But we don't really do the full speech thing anymore. We used to in academia, but we started to realize that wasn't really a necessary thing to do. Plus, I just go to YouTube and look it up, right? I always want to see for myself. I don't want a talking head telling me what my leaders said. I want to listen to it most of the time. Most of the time. Bill Clinton one time gave a speech where he used really, really clear signposting. It was like 1, 2, 3. I'm like, great, this is great, except he didn't say how many there would be. And we're like 31. I mean, it was just ridiculous. It just went on and on and on. It was one of his State of the Union addresses. I don't remember which one, but my goodness, I just remember going, okay, I can't even watch this anymore. Somebody just give me the points, okay? Write down the points and send it to me. So, again, that having somebody else interpret it for us is not necessarily a shortcut, although sometimes it is. It is definitely someone helping us to understand what is going on, what is being said. I get asked this a lot. People will email me or call me and say, or text me a lot and say, what the heck was so-and-so just saying on the TV? I don't understand what's going on with the Supreme Court. It's like, I am not a judge. I am not a lawyer. I never studied law. That was my father. I did not study law, and I don't know all the rules of the Supreme Court. I'm lucky I can name most of the Supreme Court. I'm one of those people that I'm not necessarily studying it, but when I hear a certain argument made, I am able to break that down for people. So as long as I hear the argument, I can usually structure that in a way that's understandable. It would be my hope that I'm doing it accurately. Of course, that's the intent. Goodwill, all of that from Aristotle. The intent is to do it accurately. But the other intent is also to help assist them in learning about it. So, somebody said to me the other day, they were like, the Nixon School District, they're trying to ban books. They're talking about sexually explicit material. They cited this court case. And I said, I came up with the one, and they're like, no, that wasn't it. And I said, okay. I said, PICO. And they said, yeah. And I'm like, oh, dear God. And they're like, what's the matter? I'm like, well, PICO didn't come to a conclusion. It was a 4-4 split, and one sat out. And, it sort of left the interpretation up to people. And it's frustrating. But there is the Miller test, which is the first court case, the Miller court case, where you can use that to tell whether or not it would qualify as pornographic or sexually explicit material. And that's the one we're supposed to be operating from. So whenever people cite PICO, what they're really doing is saying, we're going to determine what we want for ourselves. And that's very frustrating. But you can imagine how hard it is for people to listen to, well, we're not going with the Miller test, we're going with PICO. And what the hell does that mean? Right? And unless you have some knowledge about the subject matter, you need to go ask somebody or go look up those court cases, I guess, if you're really desperate. But there are certain things that I know. There are certain things that you know that I don't. And so certainly if I have a question about my car, I go to my Nissan guy, I call up Chase and say, hey, my car needs fixed. I don't try to do it myself. Or I try to explain the problem. I'm giving them sounds and noises. I'm not even speaking English, right? So you know how this works. We translate things for people to make them more understandable. That's sort of what a rhetorician does. Granted, it's from the same language, but sometimes it doesn't sound like it. Okay. So I don't know why I got into that, but that is the job of the rhetorician. And in memoria, what we're really talking about with memoria in the Italian or the Latin, is about making sure that we get the right message accurately across to those that we're speaking to. And then finally, delivery. Now, delivery, this does not mean that delivery is not important. It's one of the 5 canons. It's absolutely important, but it's the last one. It's at the bottom of the pile. Why? Because you could have the greatest delivery in the world and say absolutely nothing. And so if you don't establish the first 4 rules, if you don't fill those in first, then it doesn't matter how good your delivery is. And delivery is not style, by the way. Delivery is literally the function of using nonverbal cues and paralanguage for the purpose of making your argument. Okay? So read through that. I'm actually going to wrap this up here because it's already 48 minutes. There are some other things to look for in Cicero. I believe that he has the 3 types of narrative. That's important. When we should start learning rhetoric, that's important. That's in there. And sort of where it belongs, because he really starts to set up the educational system that we have. Rhetoric used to be one of the 5 R's. And arithmetic does not start with an R. So rhetoric actually really did start with an R, and somehow we got rid of it. We're down to 3. Well, 2 R's and an A. So, I'm not really sure how we got there, but he really starts sort of the standards for the education system. And that includes rhetoric, because he says that essentially no one can function in a democracy, in any kind of democracy, if they don't understand rhetoric, how to practice it, or how to listen to it, or how to help our fellow citizens by doing it for them. All right. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to come back and do a second video. I apologize. I thought I could go through this much more quickly. I think I went down too many rabbit trails. So I'll pick this up again maybe tomorrow. And in the meantime, you all use this, absorb this, read your Cicero and Quintilian, and I'll be back with you in a couple days.